In the galaxy of Star Wars, there are many different groups, but one of the biggest and most powerful was the Galactic Empire. You can think of the Empire like a giant space government that wanted to control the whole galaxy. It had spaceships, armies, and leaders who made rules for everyone else. Now, just like in real-life armies, the Empire had something called ranks. A rank is like a level or a job title that shows who's in charge. For example, if you've ever played a game, you know that players might level up to become stronger. In the Empire, soldiers and officers could level up too, but instead of video game levels, they got new uniforms, new powers, and new responsibilities. Ranks are important because they tell everyone who is the boss and who has to listen. Imagine if all the stormtroopers just did whatever they wanted. It would be complete chaos. With ranks, everyone knew their place. The higher your rank, the more people had to follow your orders. At the very bottom were the regular stormtroopers. These were the soldiers in white armor that you see all the time in Star Wars movies. They didn't get to make big decisions. They just followed orders. But above them were officers, people with fancy uniforms who gave commands and made plans. These officers wore gray or black uniforms, and if you look closely, you'll see they have colorful rectangles on their chests. These rectangles are called rank plaques or rank badges. They're like little name tags that show what level they are. The more squares or colors they had, the more important they were. But it doesn't stop there. There were also commanders of star destroyers, admirals in charge of whole fleets, and even grand admirals who were like space generals for the entire galaxy. Above them all was Darth Vader and, of course, Emperor Palpatine, the ruler of the Empire. So, when we talk about Imperial ranks, we're basically talking about a ladder of power. At the bottom are the people who just follow orders. In the middle are the people who give some orders. And at the very top are the people who control everything. But here's the fun part. Star Wars doesn't always tell us clearly what every rank means. Sometimes the movies, TV shows, books, and games show us different pieces of the puzzle. So, learning about the Imperial ranks is kind of like solving a mystery. We put together all the clues from different stories to understand who is who. Over the next parts, we're going to climb this ladder of power, starting at the bottom and working our way all the way to the top. You'll get to meet the stormtroopers, the officers, the admirals, the moffs, and even the grand moffs. By the time we're done, you'll know every single Imperial rank explained. Let's start at the beginning with the soldiers everyone knows best, the stormtroopers. When you think of the Empire, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most people, it's those white armored soldiers marching in lines. That's right, the stormtroopers. Stormtroopers were the foot soldiers of the Empire. Imagine an enormous army where every single soldier looks the same. They all wore shiny white armor that covered their whole body, and they carried blasters. Stormtroopers weren't in charge of anything big. They were the ones following orders, like chess pieces being moved by someone else. But here's the thing. Stormtroopers were more than just random soldiers. They were trained to be loyal to the Empire no matter what. If an officer told them to march, they marched. If an officer told them to attack, they attacked. They weren't supposed to question orders. There were actually different kinds of stormtroopers. For example, snowtroopers were stormtroopers trained for icy planets like Hoth. They wore extra gear to keep warm. Scout troopers rode speeder bikes and were used to explore dangerous areas, like forests. They wore lighter armor so they could move fast. Sand troopers carried backpacks and gear to survive in hot deserts like Tatooine. So even though they were all stormtroopers, they had special jobs depending on the planet or mission. Now, stormtroopers didn't have colorful rectangles on their chests like officers did. Their rank was shown by markings on their shoulder pads or armor. Some had orange shoulder pads that showed they were squad leaders, meaning they were in charge of a small group of troopers. But compared to officers, even the highest stormtrooper leader was still low on the ladder of power. Stormtroopers were everywhere. They guarded cities, patrolled space stations, and fought rebels. They made the Empire look strong and scary because they always showed up in huge numbers. But they weren't perfect. In fact, one of the biggest jokes about stormtroopers is that they weren't very good at aiming their blasters. In the movies, they miss shots a lot. Still, the Empire didn't care too much about that. They cared more about having thousands and thousands of them ready to fight. Stormtroopers were important, but they were just the bottom step of the ladder. They could never give orders to officers, admirals, or anyone higher. Their job was simple: do what they're told. If you think about it, they were like the pawns in a big game of chess. There were tons of them, and they did all the basic fighting. So, the stormtroopers are where the Imperial ranks begin. They're the soldiers everyone recognizes, but they're only the starting point. Above them are the people who actually give the orders. That brings us to the next level, the junior officers. Now that we've talked about stormtroopers, let's move up the ladder to the officers. Officers were people who didn't wear white armor. Instead, they wore gray or black uniforms with those colorful rectangles on their chests. The rectangles showed their rank, which was kind of like a badge of power. At the bottom of the officer ranks were junior officers. These were people who had just started their careers in the Empire's Navy or Army. They weren't in charge of giant star destroyers or fleets yet. Instead, they had smaller jobs like managing squads of stormtroopers or keeping control of a small part of a ship. Think of them like student leaders in school. They get to tell a few people what to do, but they're not the principal or the teacher. They're still learning, but they're trusted with a little bit of power. Junior officers were often the ones standing behind control panels on ships. They checked the systems, pressed buttons, and made sure things were working right. They weren't the ones making big decisions, but they made sure orders from higher-ups were carried out correctly. One thing that's important about Imperial officers is how serious they looked. They almost never smiled, and they always followed the rules. The Empire liked officers who were strict and didn't ask questions. If you wanted to move up in rank, you had to be loyal and obey everything. So, junior officers were the first step above stormtroopers. They could give orders to soldiers, but they still had to follow commands from higher officers. They were like the assistant managers of the Empire. Important, but not too important yet. And speaking of moving up, let's talk about the next level: captains. A captain in the Empire was someone who had proven themselves. They weren't just button pushers anymore. Captains were trusted to lead. In the Imperial Navy, a captain usually commanded a starship. That could be something smaller, like a light cruiser, or even a powerful star destroyer. If you were the captain of a star destroyer, that meant thousands of crew members and stormtroopers followed your orders. That's a lot of responsibility. On the ground, captains could also command large groups of stormtroopers or even entire bases. They were the ones who made sure missions were carried out successfully. Captains wore uniforms just like other officers, but their rank plaques had more colorful squares, showing they were higher up the ladder. If a junior officer said one thing and a captain said another, guess who everyone listened to? The captain, of course. Captains also had to be smart. They weren't just about giving orders. They had to make quick decisions during battles. For example, if rebels attacked, the captain had to decide whether to fight, retreat, or call for reinforcements. A bad choice could cost the Empire a ship or a base, so captains carried a lot of pressure. One famous Imperial captain you might remember is Captain Needa from The Empire Strikes Back. He was the captain of a star destroyer called the Avenger. When the Millennium Falcon escaped, he had to report directly to Darth Vader. Sadly for him, Vader wasn't very forgiving of mistakes. So captains were powerful, but they still had people above them. The next step up from captain was commander, someone with even more control over the Empire's forces. Commanders were the next big step above captains, and they carried even more responsibility. If captains were trusted to lead a single ship or base, commanders had the power to control whole groups of ships or larger numbers of soldiers. They were like the glue that kept the Empire's massive forces working together. A commander in the Imperial Navy could be in charge of several star destroyers at once, or they might be placed in control of a very important mission. On the ground, a commander might lead an entire legion of stormtroopers, which could mean thousands of soldiers waiting for their orders. That's a huge leap from just running a squad or a single ship. Commanders had to be sharp thinkers and strict leaders. They weren't the ones down in the dirt fighting battles themselves, but they were the ones making sure the battles went according to plan. If a rebel base was found, it might be a commander who designed the attack strategy, chose where to send the stormtroopers, and decided when to call in reinforcements. Their uniforms looked similar to other officers, but their rank plaques usually had more colored squares than captains. This was how everyone in the Empire knew exactly who was above who. You could tell right away whether the person standing in front of you had the power to give orders. Commanders also had to report to admirals and moffs, which meant they were often caught in the middle. On one side, they had captains and junior officers who depended on them for leadership. On the other side, they had powerful admirals and governors demanding results. It wasn't an easy job. One thing that made commanders stand out was their ability to organize huge amounts of people and ships. Think about how many stormtroopers were needed to control planets, guard star destroyers, and chase down rebels. Without commanders, all that power would have been a mess. Sometimes commanders were also given special assignments by Darth Vader himself, or even Emperor Palpatine. Imagine the pressure of having Vader breathing down your neck, making sure you did everything perfectly. Commanders who failed often didn't get second chances. So while stormtroopers did the fighting and captains ran single ships, commanders were the ones making the big picture decisions that held everything together. They were higher up the ladder with more power and more risk. And above them, the chain of command only got scarier, because the next ranks were the admirals, men and women who controlled entire fleets of the Empire's navy. Admirals were some of the most powerful people in the entire Imperial Navy. If commanders controlled groups of ships, admirals controlled whole fleets, dozens of star destroyers, thousands of crew members, and countless stormtroopers all working together under their command. They weren't just running a single ship or mission anymore. They were deciding the fate of battles that could change the entire war. Admirals spent most of their time on star destroyers or giant space stations where they could oversee huge areas of the galaxy. They had maps, scanners, and fleets ready to move at their command. When the rebels popped up in one part of the galaxy, it was often an admiral who decided how to trap them or cut them off. Admirals weren't just leaders. They were strategists. They had to think like chess players, always planning 3 moves ahead. Their uniforms looked even fancier than the officers below them, with bigger rank plaques that had lots of colorful squares. Just by looking at an admiral's uniform, you knew they were someone very high up, someone whose orders reached far and wide. If a captain or commander argued with an admiral, there was no contest. The admiral's word was final. There were actually different kinds of admirals. Some specialized in the navy, focusing on space battles and fleets of ships. Others were more political, working closely with governors and moffs to keep entire star systems in line. No matter what kind of admiral they were, they carried incredible power, and with that power came incredible pressure. One of the most famous admirals was Admiral Piet, who we see in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Piet started as a captain, but after Admiral Ozzel made a huge mistake during the hunt for the Millennium Falcon, Vader promoted Piet on the spot. That shows how dangerous it was to be an admiral. If you succeeded, you could rise to great power. If you failed, you could lose everything. including your life. Even higher than regular admirals were Grand Admirals. These were rare, elite leaders who had almost the same level of power as moffs or governors. Grand Admirals wore striking white uniforms instead of the usual gray, which made them stand out. The most famous of these was Grand Admiral Thrawn, a brilliant tactician who became one of the Empire's deadliest leaders. Thrawn wasn't just about raw power. He studied his enemies' art, culture, and history to predict how they would fight. That made him one of the most dangerous minds in the galaxy. Admirals, whether regular or grand, were the ones who shaped the war against the rebels. They decided where to send fleets, which planets to protect, and how to crush uprisings. Without admirals, the Empire's navy would have been a scattered mess of ships with no direction. With admirals, it became one of the most feared military forces in the galaxy. But the admirals weren't the only ones with power. While they controlled fleets, there were others who ruled over entire planets and star systems. These people weren't always in the navy. They were part of the government side of the Empire. They were called moffs, and they were the next step up the ladder. Moffs were some of the most powerful rulers in the Galactic Empire, but instead of controlling fleets of ships like admirals, they controlled planets and whole star systems. Imagine a governor on Earth who is in charge of just one state or country. Now, picture someone like that, but instead of one place, they ruled dozens of planets at once. That's what a moff was. When Emperor Palpatine created the Empire, he divided the galaxy into large sections called sectors. Each sector contained many planets, and each sector was run by a moff. That meant a moff had authority over billions of people living across worlds. They weren't just military leaders, they were political leaders too, making decisions about laws, taxes, trade, and even punishments. A moff had the power to call in the navy if there were problems, and they often worked closely with admirals and commanders to keep their territory under control. If a planet tried to rebel, the moff could order stormtroopers to invade or star destroyers to blockade it. To the people living under their rule, a moff was often the most important Imperial leader they ever saw. Moffs wore uniforms similar to other officers, but they usually had more impressive rank plaques and were treated with extra respect. They didn't just represent the military, they represented the Emperor himself in their regions. To defy a moff was like defying the Empire. One of the most famous moffs in Star Wars history is Moff Tarkin. You probably remember him from A New Hope, where he commanded the Death Star. Tarkin was ruthless. He believed in something called the Tarkin Doctrine, which meant ruling through fear. Instead of trying to keep peace through kindness, Tarkin thought the best way to control people was to scare them so much that they'd never even think about rebelling. That's why the Death Star was built, to destroy entire planets and make the rest of the galaxy too afraid to resist. Moffs could be cruel, but not all of them were as terrifying as Tarkin. Some were more focused on politics and keeping things running smoothly. Still, they all had enormous power, more than most admirals or commanders. If you were an admiral, you could control fleets. But if you were a moff, you controlled everything in your sector: the people, the resources, and the military. And then there were the Grand Moffs. These were even rarer and more powerful than regular moffs. A Grand Moff wasn't just in charge of a single sector. They were in charge of whole regions, made up of multiple sectors. That's like being promoted from ruling a state to ruling an entire country. Grand Moffs answered only to the Emperor and Darth Vader. Everyone else, admirals, commanders, and regular moffs, had to listen to them. Tarkin himself was promoted to Grand Moff, which is why he had so much authority over the Death Star project. When Vader was on the Death Star with him, it was actually Tarkin who gave most of the orders, showing just how high his rank was. Moffs and Grand Moffs were the backbone of the Empire's control across the galaxy. They were the bridge between the government and the military. Without them, The Empire wouldn't have been able to rule such a massive territory. But as powerful as they were, even moffs and grand moffs weren't at the very top. Above them were two figures everyone in the galaxy feared even more: Darth Vader, the Emperor's dark enforcer, and the Emperor himself. And that's where the ladder of power gets even darker. Darth Vader was unlike anyone else in the Empire. While moffs and admirals had official titles and shiny uniforms, Vader didn't need any of that. He didn't wear rank plaques or colorful squares on his chest. He didn't carry a clipboard or give orders from behind a desk. He was power itself. Everyone in the Empire knew that Vader spoke with the authority of the Emperor, and that made him more terrifying than any moff, admiral, or commander. Vader was the Emperor's right hand, his personal enforcer. When someone failed in their duties, Vader didn't write a report or scold them. He used the Force. With just a wave of his hand, he could choke someone without touching them. We saw this many times in the movies. Captains, admirals, even high-ranking officers were killed instantly if they disappointed him. That meant nobody wanted to make mistakes when Vader was around. He didn't forgive. He didn't give second chances. Vader didn't command fleets in the same way admirals did, and he didn't govern planets like the moffs. Instead, he oversaw everything. If a moff was building a weapon, Vader checked that it was done correctly. If an admiral was chasing rebels, Vader made sure they succeeded. If there was any sign of rebellion, Vader was sent to crush it personally. His job wasn't just to give orders, it was to inspire fear. What made him even more terrifying was his mastery of the dark side of the Force. Unlike the officers and stormtroopers, Vader wasn't just a soldier. He was a Sith Lord. He could lift objects with his mind, sense where enemies were hiding, and cut through entire squads of rebels with his red lightsaber. To the regular people of the galaxy, Vader seemed less like a man and more like a dark, unstoppable monster. But Vader wasn't just muscle. He was also a strategist. He knew how to outthink his enemies, especially the rebels. He could plan ambushes, predict moves, and use his Force powers to gain the upper hand in battle. That made him both a warrior and a commander, even if he didn't hold a regular military rank. Even the most powerful admirals and moffs showed him respect. If Vader gave an order, they obeyed. They knew that even though they had titles and positions, Vader had something far greater: the Emperor's trust. Vader could walk into any meeting, cut off any plan, and change it however he wanted. Nobody dared to argue. There was also another reason Vader was so feared: his loyalty to the Emperor. Everyone in the Empire knew that the Emperor trusted him above all others. That meant if you crossed Vader, you were also crossing Palpatine. And nobody wanted that. So while admirals controlled fleets and moffs controlled territories, Vader controlled fear. He was the shadow hanging over the Empire, the reminder that disobedience meant death. And while he seemed unstoppable, he still wasn't at the very top. There was one person even more powerful, the mastermind behind the entire Empire, the one who pulled all the strings. That was Emperor Palpatine. Emperor Palpatine was the very top of the Empire, the highest rank of all, and the true ruler of the galaxy. While stormtroopers, officers, captains, commanders, admirals, and moffs all had their own jobs and responsibilities, every single one of them answered to him. No one was above Palpatine, not even Darth Vader. He wasn't just the Emperor by title, he was also a Sith Lord, the most powerful dark side user alive at the time, and the mastermind behind everything the Empire became. Palpatine began as a politician in the Republic, pretending to care about peace and fairness. But in secret, he was manipulating everything, setting up wars, and tricking people into giving him more and more power. When the Clone Wars ended, he transformed the Republic into the Empire and declared himself Emperor. From that moment on, he ruled the galaxy with absolute authority. Unlike admirals or moffs, Palpatine didn't wear a military uniform. He usually wore long, dark robes with a hood that hid his face. His appearance was frightening: wrinkled skin, glowing yellow eyes, and a cruel smile. Just looking at him, you could tell he was dangerous. He didn't need colorful rank plaques or medals. Everyone already knew he was the most powerful person in the galaxy. Palpatine's power came from two places: the government and the dark side of the Force. As Emperor, he had complete control over laws, armies, and resources. If he wanted a planet destroyed, he gave the order, and the Death Star carried it out. If he wanted more ships built, entire star systems worked day and night to make it happen. Nobody could argue with him because his word was law. But what made him truly terrifying was his mastery of the dark side. He could shoot lightning from his hands, cloud people's minds, and sense things happening across the galaxy. He wasn't just a ruler sitting on a throne, he was a predator, always watching, always planning. He didn't just want control of planets and fleets. He wanted control of people's hearts and minds. Palpatine also had a way of making people obey him, even without using the Force. He was clever and manipulative, able to twist words and promises so that people believed serving him was the right choice. He tricked the galaxy into giving him power in the first place, and he kept it by ruling through fear. Even the bravest leaders in the Empire, moffs, grand moffs, admirals, trembled when they had to speak to the Emperor. They knew that if they failed him, their punishment would be worse than death. And with Darth Vader by his side, Palpatine had someone to carry out his punishments swiftly and brutally. At the very top of the Imperial ranks, Palpatine stood alone. There was no one higher, no one to question his decisions. The entire ladder of power, from stormtroopers to officers, captains, commanders, admirals, moffs, and even Darth Vader, existed only to serve him. He was the reason the Empire was so feared across the galaxy, because as long as he sat on the throne, the dark side ruled everything. But in the end, even Palpatine wasn't untouchable. His own apprentice, Darth Vader, turned against him to save his son, Luke Skywalker. In that final moment, the Emperor who ruled the galaxy with fear and darkness was destroyed. Still, during the time of the Empire, Palpatine was the ultimate rank, the one who decided the fate of entire worlds with a single command. He was the peak of the ladder, the final step above all others. The Empire was built like a giant ladder, with every step leading higher and higher in power. At the very bottom were the stormtroopers. They were the soldiers in white armor, the ones everyone recognized. They didn't make decisions or plan battles. They just followed orders, marching, guarding, and fighting wherever they were told to go. They were like the pawns in a massive chess game, doing the bulk of the work but never moving on their own. Above them came the junior officers. These were the people in gray or black uniforms with small rank plaques on their chests. They had just begun their careers, running small groups of troops or controlling parts of a ship. They didn't have much power yet, but they were trusted enough to give basic orders and keep things organized. Next came the captains. A captain could run a whole starship or a large group of stormtroopers. They had to make important decisions in battles and were responsible for keeping missions on track. Their uniforms showed more colorful squares, and their authority stretched much farther than a junior officer's. After the captains came the commanders. Commanders were in charge of much larger groups, fleets of ships, whole legions of soldiers, or huge operations against the rebels. They were the ones making strategies, deciding how to attack, and making sure the Empire's power stretched across space. They carried the weight of many lives and missions on their shoulders. Above the commanders were the admirals. Admirals didn't just lead ships, they led fleets. Dozens of star destroyers and thousands of crew members all answered to them. Admirals were like the chess players, moving pieces across the board of the galaxy. They decided when to attack, when to retreat, and how to trap the rebels. At the very top of this level were the Grand Admirals. special leaders like Thrawn, who were trusted with almost unmatched authority. But while admirals controlled fleets, moffs controlled space itself. A moff ruled over entire sectors of the galaxy, with authority over countless planets and billions of people. They weren't just military leaders, they were governors with political power. If a planet rebelled, a moff could order the navy to crush it. If a region needed order, a moff made the laws. At the top of this group were the Grand Moffs, like Tarkin, who ruled not just sectors but whole regions of space. Standing above all of these ranks was Darth Vader. He wasn't a moff, admiral, or commander. He was something different. Vader was the Emperor's enforcer, the one who made sure everyone stayed in line. He didn't need a badge or a uniform. His black armor, his red lightsaber, and his mastery of the Force were all the proof anyone needed. Vader inspired fear everywhere he went, and even the highest-ranking officers obeyed him without question. And finally, at the very top, sat Emperor Palpatine. He was the mastermind, the Dark Lord who controlled the galaxy through fear, manipulation, and the dark side of the Force. Every soldier, every officer, every admiral, and every moff existed to serve him. His word was law, his power was unmatched, and his shadow stretched across every corner of the galaxy. So from stormtroopers at the bottom to Palpatine at the top, the Imperial ranks formed a massive pyramid of control. Each step up the ladder meant more power, more responsibility, and more fear. Together, they created the terrifying machine that was the Galactic Empire, a system where everyone served, and no one, not even the highest admirals or moffs, could ever feel truly safe under the watchful eyes of Vader and the Emperor. When you think of the Empire, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most people, it's those white-armored soldiers marching in lines. That's right, the stormtroopers. Stormtroopers were the foot soldiers of the Empire. Imagine an enormous army where every single soldier looks the same. They all wore shiny white armor that covered their whole body, and they carried blasters. Stormtroopers weren't in charge of anything big. They were the ones following orders, like chess pieces being moved by someone else. But here's the thing, stormtroopers were more than just random soldiers. They were trained to be loyal to the Empire no matter what. If an officer told them to march, they marched. If an officer told them to attack, they attacked. They weren't supposed to question orders. There were actually different kinds of stormtroopers. Snowtroopers were stormtroopers trained for icy planets, like Hoth. They wore extra gear to keep warm. Scout troopers rode speeder bikes and were used to explore dangerous areas, like forests. They wore lighter armor so they could move fast. Sand troopers carried backpacks and gear to survive in hot deserts like Tatooine. So, even though they were all stormtroopers, they had special jobs depending on the planet or mission. Now, stormtroopers didn't have colorful rectangles on their chests like officers did. Their rank was shown by markings on their shoulder pads or armor. Some had orange shoulder pads that showed they were squad leaders, meaning they were in charge of a small group of troopers. But compared to officers, even the highest stormtrooper leader was still low on the ladder of power. Stormtroopers were everywhere. They guarded cities, patrolled space stations, and fought rebels. They made the Empire look strong and scary because they always showed up in huge numbers. But they weren't perfect. In fact, one of the biggest jokes about stormtroopers is that they weren't very good at aiming their blasters. In the movies, they missed shots a lot. Still, the Empire didn't care too much about that. They cared more about having thousands and thousands of them ready to fight. Stormtroopers were important, but they were just the bottom step of the ladder. They could never give orders to officers, admirals, or anyone higher. Their job was simple. Do what they're told. If you think about it, they were like the pawns in a big game of chess. There were tons of them, and they did all the basic fighting. So, the stormtroopers are where the Imperial ranks begin. They're the soldiers everyone recognizes, but they're only the starting point. Above them are the people who actually give the orders, the officers. Officers were people who didn't wear white armor. Instead, they wore gray or black uniforms with colorful rectangles on their chests. The rectangles showed their rank, which was kind of like a badge of power. At the bottom of the officer ranks were junior officers. These were people who had just started their careers in the Empire's Navy or Army. They weren't in charge of giant star destroyers or fleets yet. Instead, they had smaller jobs like managing squads of stormtroopers or keeping control of a small part of a ship. Think of them like student leaders in school. They get to tell a few people what to do, but they're not the principal or the teacher. They're still learning, but they're trusted with a little bit of power. Junior officers were often the ones standing behind control panels on ships. They checked the systems, pressed buttons, and made sure things were working right. They weren't the ones making big decisions, but they made sure orders from higher-ups were carried out correctly. Junior officers were the first step above stormtroopers. They could give orders to soldiers, but they still had to follow commands from higher officers. They were like the assistant managers of the Empire, important, but not too important yet. Above them were the captains. A captain in the Empire was someone who had proven themselves. They weren't just button pushers anymore. Captains were trusted to lead. In the Imperial Navy, a captain usually commanded a starship. That could be something smaller, like a light cruiser, or even a powerful star destroyer. If you were the captain of a star destroyer, that meant thousands of crew members and stormtroopers followed your orders. That's a lot of responsibility. On the ground, captains could also command large groups of stormtroopers or even entire bases. They were the ones who made sure missions were carried out successfully. Captains had more colorful squares on their uniforms, showing their higher rank. If a junior officer said one thing and a captain said another, everyone listened to the captain. Captains also had to be smart. They weren't just about giving orders. They had to make quick decisions during battles. For example, if rebels attacked, the captain had to decide whether to fight, retreat, or call for reinforcements. A bad choice could cost the Empire a ship or a base, so captains carried a lot of pressure. One famous Imperial captain was Captain Nida, who sadly learned the hard way how unforgiving Vader could be when mistakes were made. Above the captains came the commanders. Commanders were in charge of much larger groups, fleets of ships, whole legions of soldiers, or huge operations against the rebels. They weren't the ones fighting directly, but they were the ones making sure battles went according to plan. If a rebel base was found, it might be a commander who designed the attack strategy, chose where to send stormtroopers, and decided when to call in reinforcements. Commanders also had to balance between those under them and those above them. They had junior officers and captains depending on them, but they also had admirals and moffs demanding results. It wasn't an easy job because they were stuck in the middle, trying to keep both sides happy while also keeping the Empire's enemies crushed. But the admirals were the ones with even bigger power. Admirals controlled entire fleets, dozens of star destroyers, and thousands of crew members. They were the masterminds of space battles, planning moves like chess players. They looked over maps of the galaxy, moved fleets into position, and decided how to trap or destroy the rebels. Admirals wore uniforms with huge rank plaques that showed everyone just how high up they were. No captain or commander could argue with an admiral. Some admirals were clever and careful, while others were reckless and failed badly. One mistake could mean Vader's anger, and we all know how dangerous that was. Admiral Piet is one example. He started as a captain but rose to admiral after his superior failed. But rising so high came with risks because admirals lived under the constant shadow of Vader and the Emperor's expectations. At the very top of the admiral ranks were the Grand Admirals. These were rare, special leaders chosen by the Emperor himself. They wore bright white uniforms that made them stand out, and they had nearly unlimited authority. The most famous of them was Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was a genius at studying his enemies and predicting their moves. He didn't just use ships and soldiers, he used his brain to outthink anyone who stood against him. While admirals commanded fleets, moffs controlled space itself. The galaxy was divided into sectors, and each sector was ruled by a moff. A moff had authority over entire systems filled with planets. They weren't just military leaders, they were political governors who made laws, collected taxes, and controlled billions of people. If a planet rebelled, the moff had the power to call in star destroyers and stormtroopers to crush it. One of the most famous moffs was Tarkin, who later became Grand Moff. Tarkin believed in ruling through fear. He thought if the galaxy was afraid enough, nobody would ever dare to fight back. That's why he oversaw the Death Star, a space station powerful enough to destroy entire planets. His plan was to terrify the galaxy into obedience. Grand Moffs like Tarkin had even more power, ruling over huge regions that contained many sectors. That meant they commanded multiple moffs and worked directly with the Emperor and Vader. They were some of the most feared people in the galaxy. But even the moffs and Grand Moffs weren't truly at the top. Darth Vader stood above them all. He didn't need a title, a rank plaque, or even a fleet. His black armor, his red lightsaber, and his mastery of the dark side made him more terrifying than any officer. Vader was the Emperor's personal enforcer. If someone failed, Vader punished them. If rebels appeared, Vader crushed them. If a project needed watching, Vader oversaw it. Everyone obeyed him because behind him stood the Emperor. And finally, at the very top, sat Emperor Palpatine. He was the ultimate ruler, the one who controlled everything. He didn't just lead the Empire, he was the Empire. Every order came from him, every fleet and every stormtrooper served him. Palpatine ruled through fear, manipulation, and the dark side of the Force. He could shoot lightning from his hands, see across the galaxy, and twist people's minds. He didn't just want control of the galaxy. He wanted control of the people living in it. So, from stormtroopers at the bottom to Palpatine at the top, the Empire was built like a massive pyramid of power. Each step up the ladder meant more responsibility and more fear. Stormtroopers followed orders, junior officers learned the ropes, captains ran ships, commanders organized battles, admirals commanded fleets, moffs ruled planets and sectors, grand moffs ruled entire regions, Darth Vader ruled through terror, and Emperor Palpatine ruled it all. That was the chain of command in the Galactic Empire, a system so strict and so frightening that it kept the entire galaxy under its control, at least until the rebels rose up and brought it crashing down.